Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
Mrs. Kate adopted a boy in a sad situation. At that time, she was 36 years old. When she was a child, she fell off her nurse's lap into the fireplace, and her face got burned. Because of this, she decided not to marry because she didn't want anyone to marry her for her money. A neighbor of hers, who became a widow just before her child was born, died during childbirth, leaving nothing behind. Mrs. Kate took the newborn child, sent him to be nursed, raised him, sent him to a boarding school, and brought him back home when he was 14. She wanted someone in her empty house to love her, take care of her, and make her old age enjoyable. She had a small country place near Rennes, and now she didn't need a servant. Her expenses doubled since the arrival of the orphan, and her income of 3,000 francs was not enough for 3 people. Mrs. Kate took care of the house and cooking herself. She sent the boy on errands and let him help in the garden. He was gentle, shy, quiet, and affectionate. Mrs. Kate felt deep happiness when he kissed her without being scared of her burned face. He called her aunt and treated her like a mother. In the evening, they both sat by the fireside, and she made delicious treats for him. They had a charming little meal before bedtime. She often took him on her lap, covered him with kisses, and called him sweet names like my little flower, my cherub, my adored angel, and my divine jewel. Even though he was almost 15, he remained small and weak, looking a bit sickly. Sometimes Mrs. Kate took him to the city to visit 2 married female relatives, distant cousins, living in the suburbs. These relatives always criticized her for adopting the boy, hoping to get a share of the inheritance. Mrs. Kate was very happy, always busy with her adopted child. She bought books for him to learn, and he loved reading a lot. He didn't sit on her lap like before. Instead, he sat in his small chair in the corner, reading a book. The lamp on the little table above his head shone on his curly hair. He didn't move, raise his eyes, or make any gestures. He read, interested and completely absorbed in the story. Sitting across from him, Mrs. Kate looked at him seriously, amazed by his dedication, often on the verge of tears. Sometimes she said, "You will tire yourself, my treasure," hoping he would lift his head and come to hug her. But he didn't even answer. He hadn't heard or understood her. He only paid attention to what he was reading. For 2 years, he read many books. His personality changed. After that, he asked Mrs. Kate for money several times, and she gave it to him. Since he always wanted more, she finally refused. She was organized and firm and knew when to act sensibly. After begging for a large sum one night, he seemed satisfied with her decision. He became quiet again, sitting for hours without moving, lost in deep thought. He didn't even talk to Mrs. Kate, responding to her with short, formal words. However, he was still polite and attentive. He just didn't embrace her anymore. Mrs. Kate started to be a bit afraid of him when they sat across from each other at night. She wanted to wake him up, make him say something, anything, to break the silence. But he didn't seem to listen, and she felt terrified as a weak woman after trying to talk to him several times without getting a response. What was wrong with him? What was happening in his closed-up head? After sitting across from him for 2 or 3 hours, Mrs. Kate felt like she was going crazy. She longed to run away and escape to the open country to avoid the silent, constant companionship and some vague danger she couldn't define but felt. She often cried when she was alone. What was wrong with him? When she made a request, he quietly carried it out. If she needed something from the city, he immediately went to get it. She had no complaints about him, no, indeed. And yet, another year passed, and it seemed like a new change had occurred in the young man's mind. Mrs. Kate noticed it, felt it, sensed it. How? No matter. She was sure she wasn't mistaken, but she couldn't explain how the unknown thoughts of this strange youth had changed. It felt like, until now, he had been uncertain, and suddenly he had made a decision. This idea came to her one evening when she met his gaze, a fixed, unusual gaze she hadn't seen in his face before. Then he started to watch her constantly, and she wished she could hide to avoid that cold eye staring at her. He stared at her, evening after evening, for hours, only looking away when she said, completely unnerved, "Don't look at me like that, my child." Then he would lower his head. But the moment her back was turned, she felt his eyes on her again. Wherever she went, he followed her with his persistent gaze. Sometimes, while walking in her small garden, she suddenly saw him hidden behind a bush, as if he were waiting for her. And when she sat in front of the house fixing socks while he worked in the vegetable bed, he kept watching her secretly. It was pointless when she asked him, "What's the matter with you, my boy? For the last 3 years, you have become very different. I don't recognize you. Do tell me what's bothering you, and what you are thinking." He always replied in a calm, tired tone, "Why, nothing bothers me, Aunt." And when she kept asking, "My child, answer me when I speak to you. If you knew what grief you caused me, you would always answer, and you would not look at me that way. Do you have any trouble? Tell me. I'll comfort you." He walked away, looking tired, mumbling, "But there is nothing the matter with me, I assure you." He hadn't grown much, always having a childlike appearance, although his features were those of a man. They were, however, hard and badly shaped. He seemed incomplete, unfinished, only half done, and unsettling like a mystery. He was a self-contained, unapproachable person, where there always seemed to be some active, dangerous mental work going on. Mrs. Kate was fully aware of all this, and she couldn't sleep at night, her anxiety was so great. Terrifying fears and dreadful nightmares plagued her. She locked herself in her room, barricading the door, tormented by fear. What was she afraid of? She couldn't tell. She feared everything: the night, the walls, the shadows cast by the moon on the white curtains of the windows, and, most of all, she feared him. Why? What did she have to fear? Did she know what it was? She couldn't live this way any longer. She was sure that a misfortune was threatening her, a terrible misfortune. She secretly set out one morning and went to the city to see her relatives. She told them about the matter in a gasping voice. The two women thought she was going mad and tried to reassure her. She said, "If you knew how he looks at me from morning till night. He never takes his eyes off me. Sometimes, I feel a longing to cry for help, to call in the neighbors, so much am I afraid. But what could I say to them? He does nothing but look at me." The two female cousins asked, "Is he ever mean to you? Does he give you sharp answers?" She replied, "No, never. He does everything I wish. He works hard, he is steady, but I am so frightened that I care nothing for that. He is planning something, I am certain of that, quite certain. I don't want to stay all alone like that with him in the country." The relatives, surprised at her words, said that people would be amazed, would not understand, and they advised her to keep silent about her fears and her plans, without, however, telling her not to move to the city, hoping in that way that the entire inheritance would eventually fall into their hands. They even promised to help her sell her house and find another one near them. Mrs. Kate went back home. But her mind was so upset that she trembled at the slightest noise, and her hands shook whenever any small disturbance agitated her. Twice she went again to consult her relatives, now determined not to stay any longer in this way in her lonely dwelling. At last, she found a little house in the suburbs, which suited her, and she privately bought it. The signing of the contract took place on a Tuesday morning, and Mrs. Kate spent the rest of the day getting ready for her move. At 8 o'clock in the evening, she got into the bus that passed within a few hundred yards of her house, and she told the driver to drop her off where she usually got off. The man called out to her as he whipped his horses, "Good evening, Mrs. Kate, good night." She replied as she walked on, "Good evening, Mr. Joseph." The next morning, at 7:30, the mailman who delivered letters to the village noticed at the crossroads, not far from the main road, a big splash of blood not yet dry. He said to himself, "Hello! Some drinker must have had a nosebleed." But he saw 10 paces farther on a handkerchief also stained with blood. He picked it up. The fabric was fine, and the mailman, alarmed, made his way over to the ditch, where he thought he saw a strange object. Mrs. Kate was lying at the bottom on the grass, her throat cut with a knife. An hour later, the police, the judge, and other authorities investigated the cause of death. The two female relatives, called as witnesses, told all about Mrs. Kate's fears and her last plans. The orphan was arrested. After the death of the woman who had adopted him, he wept from morning till night, seeming, at least to all appearances, in the most violent grief. He proved that he had spent the evening up to 11 o'clock in a cafe. 10 persons had seen him, having stayed there until his departure. The driver of the bus stated that he had dropped off the murdered woman on the road between 9:30 and 10 o'clock. The accused was acquitted. A will, drawn up a long time before, which had been left in the hands of a notary in Rennes, made him the sole heir. So he inherited everything. For a long time, the people of the country avoided him, as they still suspected him. His house, that of the dead woman, was looked upon as cursed. People avoided him in the street. But he showed himself so friendly, so open, so familiar that gradually these horrible doubts were forgotten. He was generous, helpful, ready to talk to the humblest about anything, as long as they cared to talk to him. The notary, Mr. Rameau, was one of the first to take his part, attracted by his smiling talkativeness. He said at a dinner at the tax collector's house, "A man who speaks with such ease and who is always in good humor could not have such a crime on his conscience." Touched by his argument, the others who were present thought, and they remembered the long conversations with this man who would almost force them to stop at the street corners to listen to his ideas, who insisted on them going into his house when they were passing by his garden, who could crack a joke better than the lieutenant of the police himself, and who possessed such contagious happiness that, despite the dislike he inspired in them, they could not help but always laugh in his company. All doors were open to him after a while. He is today the mayor of his township.